I am happy to be here. Happy to see all of you here, or see the few of you I can actually see on my screen. We're going to try to dive into a lot of different things because because the topic is so wide. So I'm going to basically try to from very, very far above take a look at a lot of different parts of Israeli society and see what is going on and see what the changes are that are happening inside the society. I hope I won't do it too quickly, but I definitely want to leave you guys time for questions at the end. So let's just dive right in. We're going to talk about the Israeli economy and labor market first. Just give a sort of a macro overview of what's happening inside the Israeli economy, and in particular, what's happened over the past few years. Because as we know, as I was saying before, it changed the CSP program. It also changed everything going on in Israel and in the world. So we're going to start with a little bit about the Israeli economy and the labor market. So this is basically what Israel's gross domestic product looks like, or the change in it over time. Now, what I'm doing here is comparing 2 years, 2019, that was pre-COVID, and 2020, which was, of course, the first year of COVID. And what you can see is as follows. First of all, 2019 was a fairly standard year for Israel. It looked the same over the decade preceding it, where you had growth of somewhere around 3.5% to 4% every single year, pretty much every single year. And that 3.5% to 4% basically divided equally between the different parts of GDP. So private consumption, public consumption, investment, they all went up between 3% and 4%. Everything was fairly standard throughout the entire decade. 2020 came along and everything was anything but standard. So obviously you had 2020 throwing shocks into the entire world. For Israel, instead of the economy growing at 4% a year, it contracted by about 2%. That means a difference of about 6%. Instead of going up 4, you went down 2. That's a difference of about 6% compared to what would have happened or what would have been expected to happen had COVID not reared its ugly head. What's unusual about Israel in particular, and really, really unusual because it's way out there compared to other countries, is just how much private consumption fell. Are you seeing my mouse, by the way, when I do this? You are. Okay, so it's just how much private consumption fell. And private consumption fell by an unusual level because of the fact that Israel had extreme closures and they started them very early. Israel closed down very, very early in the process compared to other countries. And as I said, things were really hermetically sealed, including the airports, including being able to go out to jobs. Things became really, really pretty extreme. Then when Israel opened up, it opened up too quickly. It opened up in some ways in an irresponsible way. And the result of that was that the second wave and the third wave of COVID hit Israel before it hit any other country. So that's what happened in Israel, and private consumption fell by a lot. So moving forward just a drop, I'm going to 2021 and comparing 2021, not to 2020, because 2020 was that weird year, to 2019, to the more standard year. And when you compare 2021 to 2019, you see that GDP grew by about 6% all told. And that 6% means that instead of growing 8% over that 2-year period, you grew by only 6%. So that's still 2% less than would have been expected had COVID never come around. That, by the way, has been made up in 2022. That's no longer any kind of deficit at all. When you take a look at what succeeded, what didn't succeed, you see that exports grew incredibly quickly in 2021. And the reason that's true is because of the high tech in Israel. Companies like Check Point in Israel, who sell firewalls and protect your computers, well, that became much more important than it was previously. And therefore, their sales went up quite a bit, and they did very, very well. Where you see Israel is still lagged behind very heavily was that private consumption that we spoke about before had only grew by 1% over that 2-year period. And that's instead of about 8%. So that's still a very, very big hit. It has to do with tourism. It has to do with travel abroad. It has to do with shutdowns continuing in part of 2021. But basically, you had that type of effect, which remained. 2022, almost all of that is done away with, although we will see there's still is a little bit lingering. Now, this graph over here is a little bit more technical to understand, but I'm going I'm showing it to you because it is very, very important for a debate that's going on inside of Israel. So this is called debt to GDP. This basically means how much your country owes in debt to loaners, to lenders, and you're taking the ratio between that and the amount of production you are creating inside of a year. And here we're looking at 2019 to 2020, and that debt to GDP ratio in Israel in 2019, you can see it there, was 60%. Now, 60% is actually a very important number. In something called the Maastricht Treaty in 1988, it was determined that countries in the European Union should try to reach a 60% debt to GDP ratio. That is what would be considered the gold landmark of getting to 60%. Israel worked very, very hard for many years, cutting deficits in order to bring their debt down. Now, what is the importance of the debt to GDP ratio? Well, it determines what kind of credit rating you get. The better your credit rating, the less interest you're going to pay. The less interest you pay, the more money you have left over to do other things that you might want to do inside of the country. So therefore, it's considered very important, and the lowering of that debt to GDP ratio helped Israel's credit rating very significantly. Came 2020, and everything obviously got shot to hell, because you went to a situation where, you know what, that was the rainy day. You were saving all this money for the rainy day. That was the rainy day. You needed to spend money in order to help populations that were facing a lot of difficulty. You can see that you went up from 60% to about 73%. You increased by another 13%. That's really a lot, but take a look at where it places Israel. It actually doesn't change anything. Israel's ranking stays just about the same as it was before. Very, very little change from what happened before, and you're in a very good place in the middle. So here's the debate. The debate is an argument between the Bank of Israel on the one hand and the finance ministry on the other hand. And it's very important for continuing Israeli development. So the debate goes as follows. The first shot was taken by the finance ministry. Okay, so let me tell you what the question is. The question is, now that we're past COVID to a very large extent, yes, the disease is still around, but we deal with it very, very differently. Now that we're past that situation of shutdowns and things along those lines, what should Israel do about cutting that deficit back down? How important is it for Israel to cut expenditure so it can try to get that back down to 60%? Should we be doing that quickly, or is it okay to take our time in getting there? Now, the finance ministry start, I'll give their first angle, was, well, if we keep it high at 73%, that could harm our credit rating, and nobody wants the credit rating to get harmed. The Bank of Israel came along and said, and by the way, we are on the side of the Bank of Israel. In fact, we even take it a little bit more extreme than they do. The Bank of Israel came along and said, you know, look at this graph. We didn't make our situation worse because of COVID. We're still in a very, very good situation. And nobody's going to start lowering your credit rating because of the fact that in 2020, given COVID, you spent a lot of money in order to help people. You can take your time getting back down. Now, why do you want to take your time getting back down? And the answer is in this graph right here. The amount of public capital in Israel and the amount of private capital in Israel is very, very, very low relative to other countries. What does that mean? That means that there's too much congestion on the roads. The transportation system is not good. The metro is not in place. You have very, very poor internet in the northern areas of the country and the southern areas of the country. All kinds of things that need to be invested in order to allow the country to continue to grow. Now, given that that is so important, that you're lacking so much, the Bank of Israel says, take this opportunity and invest in infrastructure. Invest in those roads, invest in public transportation, and you will get it back in the future. We think even more. We think you should even increase the deficit in order to get there. The finance ministry in answer, well, they say, you know what, you're right. We're not so worried about the credit rating, but we all know politicians. And the second you say, well, we have more money to spend, every politician is going to start pulling in their own direction. And the money that's being spent here will not necessarily go to the things that will help alleviate the problems. And therefore, they're against. This is an important debate happening inside of Israel, and we don't know yet where it's going to go. Of course, we have new elections coming up, So anything can happen. Unemployment in Israel, we do see unemployment had to be redefined, as you all know. Unemployment basically is usually people who are looking for a job but are not working. Now in Israel, you had about a third of the working force put on unpaid leave during that first shock. And when they were put on unpaid leave, well, on the one hand, they're not working, but on the other hand, they're not looking for a job. So therefore, they're not really defined as unemployed. So therefore, there was a new definition of unemployment, which included people who were put on furlough. It also included people who were laid off because of COVID. And what you see crazy numbers for the first wave in 2020. The second wave was over here. It started earlier than other places, as I said before, also very, very high. The third wave was over here. And here in December, we already started getting vaccinated. And because of those vaccinations, we never had the need for any other types of shutdowns, any other large increases in unemployment, because those vaccinations really protected the population to a very large degree. If we continue to look at employment in this case, it goes together with unemployment, we look at employment, there's an interesting finding here that women were affected by COVID less than men were. You take a look at women, you can see that basically there's almost no break. This includes people on furlough. There's almost no decrease when COVID started. For Arab women, there was, but then it rebounded very, very nicely. For the men, though, there was a break, and there was a decrease for each of the populations, in particular for young Arab men. And for young Arab men, we're going to talk about that later. But for Arab men, that started, but it began well before COVID. It began back in 2019. And this has to do with the building, the construction industry, and who it is that is doing the construction, where a lot of non-Israeli citizens were brought in to do that construction. And it has to do with the very, very large size of the cohort of young Arab Israeli men. And we're going to talk about that later. But if you take a look, if you know Israeli demography, so what happens is that there are two populations that don't work at very high percentages. One is Arab Israeli women, and the other is ultra-Orthodox men, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox men, who both of those populations work at relatively low proportions. The other one that you see are relatively low is Arab Israeli men, but that's a bit of a misnomer. That's a bit confusing. What's happening to a large extent in that population is because of the types of jobs that Arab Israeli men do, which are very, very largely in construction and also in manufacturing, those tend to be very menial jobs. And because they're menial jobs, you have a lot of Arab Israeli men who retire at a young age because physically they can't continue until an older age. So that low percentage you're seeing there is actually made up mostly of the older population that are working at much lower rates. For the young men, well, until the current generation, the current cohort, you basically see a very large percentage who are working, but that really got hurt during COVID also. Just to end with this, obviously, the recovery from COVID was not the same in all industries. So on the one hand, on the right-hand side, you see the high-tech sector. Well, the high-tech sector did very well. It did, slow down, the growth of it slowed down for a short while, but then it took off and it surpassed where it was going beforehand. But when you take a look at tourism and restaurants and things along those lines, so there you do see that they are still a very far away from recovery. So that's as far as I want to go with macro, and I want to move over to talk about welfare. So this is a measure of the percentage of people under a poverty line. What is a poverty line? So I've got to tell you what a poverty line is. So a poverty line basically is a number that says anybody who earns less than that amount per month is below the poverty line. Anybody who earns more than that amount per month is above the poverty line. Poverty lines tend to be measured either the way you do it in the United States, by building a basket and asking how much it costs, and then saying anybody who earns less than that is below the poverty line, anybody who earns more than that is above the poverty line, or doing it the way they do in the rest of the developed world, aside from the United States, which is basically saying what is the median income, take some percentage of that median income, and then usually it's 50%. It could be 60%, but usually it's 50%. And that is defined as the poverty line. Anybody earning less than that is below the poverty line. Anybody earning more than that is above the poverty line. And that's how you define it. What's the problem with the way you do it in the US? The problem is it's very hard to define the basket. And that's something that people will argue about. What should be in there and what should not be in there. It's very easy on the other hand, to calculate the median income. That's really simple. You just press a button on your computer and you can have the median income. The problem with that measure is if you double everybody's income, the percentage below the poverty line does not change at all. It stays exactly the same because everybody's income is doubled. So therefore, it's more of a measure of relative income. It's more of a measure of distribution of income than it is a measure of the word poverty, like we tend to like to think about the word poverty. But putting that aside, so Israel, you can define it either with your market income, which is your gross pay before paying taxes, before getting any government assistance, or disposable income. When you take a look at Israel from respect to market income, they're doing fine. Poverty is very high. When you take a look with respect to disposable income, poverty in Israel is very, very high. It's one of the highest of all the countries, very similar to what it is in the United States, just a tad below, which is, we were above it until recently. We're just a tad below what it is inside the United States. If we take a look at different populations, for the ultra-Orthodox population, the Haredim over here, or the Arab Israelis, you can see that the poverty rate is somewhere around 45%. That's very, very high, obviously. For the Bedouin in the south, it's even higher. It's about 61%. You also see that when you have families in which both the husband and wife both work, poverty rates are very, very low. They're only about 5%. And you can divide this up in many, many different ways, obviously. Finally, the only last thing I'll talk about with respect to welfare is this thing called the Gini index. Now, just to tell you what the Gini index, it's a number between 0 and 1, where if everybody here on the call has the exact same income, then the Gini index will be equal to 0. And if Ari has all the income and everybody else has 0, then the index will be equal to 1. So the higher the number, the more you are unequal. As you can see, the US and Israel have the highest rates of inequality, the highest amount of inequality of dispersion of income across the economy. Israel was higher than the US, but Israel is the only developed country in which for almost 20 years already, the level of inequality has been going down and not been going up. It's still incredibly high. It is very, very high, but it's been going down. And that's because of steps that were taken to get the weaker populations into the labor force. And that had a very, very big impact over time on the level of inequality. Again, we're trying to ride a lot of different horses at the same time. So taking a quick look at what's happening in the health market inside of Israel. This is the number of physicians per population. Now, part of the decrease that you see happening over time is because the population in Israel is constantly rising. We have a lot of children that are born, and we grow by almost 2% a year. The population grows. So when you see the decrease going on over here, that's not necessarily fewer doctors. It's actually just more people that they have to treat. The large growth over here was the large aliyah, the migration into Israel from the former Soviet Union, where you had a country of 4.5 million people with 1 million people coming into that country. And they were very highly educated. There were many, many, many doctors that got absorbed into the economy. That was that large rise over here. Since then, it's been basically stagnant, falling a little bit. The rise now is because of the opening of 2 new medical schools inside of Israel, one in Tzfat and one in Ariel, and also because of a lot of Israelis who go and study medicine outside of Israel and then come back into Israel to work. If you compare us to other countries, you can see that Israel's in the middle compared to the other developed countries, the OECD of the developed countries. But the problem is that if you take a look at the age structure of the doctors in Israel, they're very, very, very elderly compared to other countries. Here we have the percentage 55 and over. And the thing is that the reason that it's such a large percentage is that same migration from the former Soviet Union. A lot of people came, but they aged. and they're now at an age where many of them are retiring. So what that means is that Israel faces a real concern going forward with the ability to retain the size of a medical staff that they have now. If you take a look at the number of nurses, the situation is actually much worse, because there Israel is towards the bottom of the list of the number of nurses per population, and that, of course, is a very significant problem inside of hospitals in Israel. Running on to a drop of education. So I'll show you that what's happened is that class size in Israel has always been a very big issue, because we have a very large number of children, and therefore very large classes. But the class sizes have, for the most part, been going down significantly over time. And the number of students per teacher has also been going down significantly over time. And of course, that makes for a perhaps better education system. There you can argue one way or the other. The other thing that's happened is that the education level of teachers has significantly risen. You can see that more of the teachers in both the Jewish schools and the Arab schools, many more of them have BAs, many more of them have MAs, and of course that's very important in order to improve the education system inside of the country. The last thing I'm going to do with you, I don't know how much time you want to give me, Ari. So I'm trying to do this quickly so that we can leave as much time as possible for questions. The last thing I'm going to do with you is talk about a very, very critical, important issue that's going on inside of Israel that deals with crime, and in particular deals with crime in the Arab Israeli society. So if you take a look at what's happening, and this is an interesting, I think, an interesting combination of these different things here, we're going to take a look and try to understand what that means and what the source of that crime is. So if you take a look at the number of murders in Israel, so the number of murders in the Jewish sector among the Jewish population has been going down over time, while in the Arab sector, since about 2015, it's been going up a lot. It's more than doubled. If I would put the 22 numbers up there, they don't look good at all. They look very bad, in fact. And what you have now is a situation where 80% of the murders are happening in 20% of the population. And that's sort of like, it sounds like Pareto, but that's not Pareto at all. And if we take a look at another graph showing, which I'm not going to show you, looking at how safe people feel who live, the Arab society feels where they live, and the Jewish society feels where they live, the Arab society feels very, very unsafe in their own villages. And that's because of all the violence that has become much, much, much more significant. And what we're going to try to do now in the 5 minutes that we have here, or 10 minutes that we have here, is try to understand what it is that is driving that violence inside of the Arab society. So this is a chart that basically shows you the Arab population for every single age. The Arab population, Arab men and women, age 0, age 1, age 2, age 3, every year separately. These aren't 5-year categories. Each year is separate. And what you see here bracketed around there is ages 18 to 22. Now, if you take a look, what you're seeing is a bulge in ages 18 to 22. In some respect, it parallels the bulge over here. Okay, it's just a generation later. Okay, so you had more adults those ages, therefore you have more children, but it's even a much larger bulge. And if you take a look at what's happening here, then you can see that numbers like this are not going to repeat themselves until the very, very young cohorts. For the next 15 years or so, we're not going to be getting those same numbers repeating themselves. In fact, it collapses in the next few years. That's going to be very important for our discussion. The black area over here in the middle, that is the difference between the number of men and the number of women of that age. Okay, so that's the number of men minus the number of women. For the older ages, there are more women. For the younger ages, there are more men. Now, these ages 18 to 22, are very, very dangerous ages with respect to violence. Those are the ages that in Hebrew we would say muadim lepuradut. Those are ages in which people really can be violent and can be involved in crime. And this is not something in the Arab society. This is something worldwide. Those are the ages that are most susceptible to people being involved in unwanted activities. In particular, in particular. By the way, let me just tell you, Israeli Arabs constitute 21% of the population. But in this age group, they are almost 30% of the population. In other words, this bulge is not happening in the Jewish population, that only exists inside the Arab population. Now, if you take a look at this group, when you have a bulge like that, a lot of young people, and they are socially excluded, that leads to social and political instability. Now, what does socially excluded mean? So socially excluded means any of the following. You're not, or all of the following. You're not involved in any kind of pro-social framework. For instance, a lot of dropouts, a lot of them drop out from high school, can show you this. They're not working, a very high unemployment rate. They're not in college. They're not in any kind of other pro-social framework like doing community service or serving in the army. Well, they don't serve in the army automatically. They're not let into the army. And there's very few who do community service. And they're also not married because at this point, 18 to 22, they're really too young to be married. The average age at which Arab young men marry is about 28, and I'll get back to that in a little while. So let me show you one by one. So the dropout rates, these are the official dropout rates. You can see that things are getting better over time, but that the Arab boys are still the ones who have the highest dropout rates. And from what I'm told from people in the know, from people who are educators inside of the Arab populations, these are gross underestimates. The numbers in reality that are not in school is much higher than the official numbers. Shouldn't surprise anybody. With respect to working, so we spoke before about this drop for the Arab young men, that there was a large drop. It has come back to a large extent. If I were to tell you the current numbers look about as follows. If you take that group about 18 to 25, you would find that about 40% of them are not employed. 60, these are the ones who are not in school. 40% of those who are not in school are not employed. During COVID, it was more like 60%. So that's a very, very large percentage who are not working. If we take a look at schooling, so with respect to schooling, 2/3 of those who go to university, go and get a higher education, are women. They're the ones who are pulling things forward. Only about 1/3 are men. That's for both a BA and for a PhD. And if you take a look at MAs, people studying for an MA, it's about 3/4 that are women. So if I translate that into actual percentages, only about 18% of the young Arab men are getting a higher education, and about twice that of women. About 34% of women are getting higher education in the Arab populations. This is much, much lower than in the Jewish population. So they're not in school. And now I'm going to get back to the issue of marriage. So here we have the 28-year-olds who are getting 27, 28, who are getting married. And on average, the average Arab man marries a woman who is 6 years younger than him. Okay, that's the gap in the Arab population. In the Jewish population in Israel, the gap is about 2 years. But in the Arab population, it's about 5 to 6 years. And therefore, these men are marrying these women. So you actually have here more women in the what we cold-hearted economists call the marriage market. You have more women than you have men. Now, one thing that's happening is that among the Bedouin, many of the men marry more than one woman. So therefore, that lowers the number of women. But you have some type of a match between the number of men and the number of women. So most men who want to get married can usually find somebody to get married with. That's what's happening now. Now let's fast forward to that bulge, to that youth bulge. That youth bulge, when their time comes to get married and they're looking for wives, they're looking for wives over here from the collapse of the number of women. And there's going to be a huge mismatch between the number of men looking for a spouse and the number of women looking for a spouse. And if you take a look at the percentage there, you're going to see that within a very short time period, we're moving to a period where the number of men is higher than the number of women, and even significantly higher. And that's not going to end for about 15 years. Now, add to that, that's whether they have 2 years between them in the marriage age, 4 years or 6 years. So we took all the different possibilities. Add to that two other things. Add to that the Bedouin marrying more than one woman, and add to that a mismatch in education. Now, the mismatch in education is having a very, very large effect on Arab society. The women are more educated than the men. Many of these more educated women do not want to marry a man who is less educated than them. And many of the uneducated men don't want to marry a woman who is more educated than them. So you have even a bigger mismatch. And we know that marriage rates are going down. We're going to be putting out some information on that in our next book. The marriage rates are going down. People are getting married later. And in addition to all that, the divorce rates are going up. And they're going down in the Jewish population, but they're going up in the Arab population. And the importance of all this is that we're at a point right now where things are expected to get worse. In other words, if we have a lot of violence happening when they're 18 to 22 and they remain unemployed and they remain uneducated and they don't even get married, so that they're not getting into any kind of a solid framework, it could get much worse than it is now. And the Arab population has to know that this is an issue. And the Israeli leadership needs to know that this is an issue. And these are things that need to be looked at now and not where they continue to explode. That is what I prepared for you. I was told to keep it short. I hope it was short enough so we could leave time for questions.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. I don't know whether we should can we get rid of the share so we can have you full screen and digest? Yeah, I did not go to University of Chicago, so it's going to take me a little time. But Harrison Jan will probably explain a lot more to me. I was trying to read the chart sideways in different directions. And so here are some things that I pulled out that I want to ask you about. You and I talked briefly. Let's start with the election. Israel's having an election November 1st. We're having an election November 8th. Our election, it's certainly the midterms, are always based on economics. We have high inflation. People can't afford grocery items. They can't. The gas is going up and down. It's very volatile. We've got, that's on one hand, and usually that election is based on purely economics here. We've got social issues now as well. Women's right to choose has been decimated by the Supreme Court. It's a big battle. We're going to see what happens November 8th. In Israel, November 1st, is Israeli elections, is it based on economics and things that you have shown us, or is it based on completely other issues? Does it matter about the gap in the richest to the poorest? Does it matter about poverty line? Does it matter about gas or food costs?
So very little. I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all. The only way in which economics is really a story and issue right now in these elections is because of increasing prices. Now, prices in Israel have not increased nearly as much as they have in the US. You guys are talking about 9% inflation. We're talking about 4.5% inflation. And yes, that's high for Israelis. Israelis got used to a life with no inflation at all since about 2013. So therefore, the high cost of living is definitely an issue, but it's not an issue that's really being hammered on by anybody, because that's not where the story really lies, not inside of Israel.
So it'll be interesting for us. We'll be there for election November 1st, and we'll be there for the US election. And it'll be, you know, I've never been there for an election, although you have many of them, so maybe it's not unique anymore to come to be there.
It seems like we have them every half a year or so.
Right. So let's talk about this jump around. People asked about the violence. When you talked about violence, murder in the Arab community, is that Arab on Arab violence that you're talking about?
Yeah. Yes. We're not talking about terror strike, talking about Arab on Arab. And by the way, most of it is men being killed and not women being killed. There's also a big issue of violence against women. That's a very, very big issue, but that's a relatively small percentage of the murders that are happening.
Does this also increase violence in Israel, against Jewish Israelis? So if you have this big group of young Arab Israelis who are, having challenges, does that in your studies show to lead to increased violence against Jewish Israelis as well?
That is something that has become an increase in recent months. That's actually increased very significantly, and you do see things that you hadn't seen here for a very long time. Yeah, so that's coming now also.
And you talked about in the Israeli Arab population about women getting greater education than men. My understanding is that's the same thing in the Haredi community. Is that correct? Are the Haredi women getting more advanced education than men, and how does that playing out in that community?
Yes, there's no question that's true. But let's, I mean, yes, you're right. Haredi women tend to get more of higher education than the men do, unless, of course, you talk about yeshiva studies in a seminar, in religious studies as being higher education, which of course they view it that way.
I do not, only because I'm trying to do apples to apples, and I'm trying to compare job,
Right.
prospects.
That's right. So if you do take a look at that, you would see more women who are getting a higher education than men are. The education they're coming with from high school is also much, much better. So the women are working at much higher rates than the men are working, and in the Jewish community, and they are also the ones with greater education. In the Arab society, the situation is the opposite. The men are working at much higher percentages, but the women are the ones who have much higher level of education. The Arab Israeli women who get a higher education almost all go out to the workforce. That's not necessarily true for the Haredi men, but probably true.
I don't know how many years ago now it's been, but there was major economic unrest in Israel with protests, people taking over streets. I think it was because of the cost of living, apartments, and young people not being able to afford a place to live. What has happened with that whole movement? Why don't we see that anymore?
Well, that was back in 2011. There was a very, very large social protest in 2011, and the country put together a committee headed by Manuel Trachtenberg, and tried to take steps to try to alleviate certain things. It was originally started from two issues. One was the price of housing, as you just said. The other was the price of cottage cheese was the other big spark at that time. But in general, if you take a look at what's happened to prices in Israel, Israel is expensive. Israel is expensive compared to most countries. That's a very, very big issue inside of Israel. The reason it's so expensive is because of a lack of competition, and that causes very, very high prices. With respect to housing prices, that is still a huge issue. And housing prices have been going up since about 2008. And even though the amount being purchased currently has been going down, prices have not been going down. And the housing prices all have to do, or pretty much all have to do, with a supply and demand issue. That the demand for housing has been going up very significantly, both because of the 2% increase in population every year, but also as an investment venue. But the supply of housing, of land for housing, has not been going up nearly as quickly. And building housing in Israel takes a very long time to get the permits.
But you said that things have calmed down. I try to understand what has happened in Israeli society. It kind of peaked and then seems to have sputtered out. When we go to Israel, as a tour group, we're not going to see people living in tents downtown Tel Aviv, right? Like protesting.
No, you're not.
In the U.S., there's been incredible increase in poverty. If you go to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, there's a lot of poor people who just can't live anywhere, and they're living on the streets in tents in downtown. Is that happening at all in Israel?
That's really very, very unusual in Israel. The welfare programs do a better job, and the percentage of people in that type of situation is very, very small. As I said before, the poverty level in Israel is considered high, but that's being measured as relative poverty, and not as absolute poverty. So no, you don't really have the same type of situation you have. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all, but it's very, very, very minor.
When we talked about the income gap, it is important to know that the people in America who are poor don't get access to the same kind of healthcare. There's not socialized medicine. They can't go to universities because they can't afford it. So Israel really is still a social welfare state, right? I mean, if you're in the poverty line, you still have a much better life in a way, but I would say, I don't know how to say it. You have more access to this welfare than you do in the United States, correct? Is that what you were saying?
That's absolutely correct. The health system is really quite excellent. In particular, primary health is excellent. The problems that exist tend to exist at the hospital level. The number of certain specialties that are insufficient with respect to the number of doctors. But you do get that, and you do get good health, good assistance from the welfare system.
I want to jump since we are coming to visit you as tourists. In the old days, I think travel and tourism was a major component of the Israeli economy, and I want to understand where it is today, and as a percentage of like GDP, and how dependent is Israel on tourists, and Harris and Jan spending their money when they come there, and also just so you know, I mean, costs for us have gone up 30 to 40% just since we planned this is the third in our trilogy of CSP trips to Israel. We did one in 2014, one in 2017. And we had one planned for 2019. The costs, we had to postpone 2019, then cancel it and rebook it. And the cost from 19 to now is up 30 to 40%. Primarily, I would say hotels are just charging. So kind of want to understand how important is tourism to the Israeli economy, and are you seeing the same thing that we're experiencing with tremendous increases in that sector and costs for a variety of reasons? I assume they're trying to make up what they lost.
Right. Tourism is not it's not one of the largest sectors inside of Israeli economy. It's important to Israel. It's very important to Israel, tourism, and it does add a lot to the economy. But I don't actually know the actual percentage, but it's not a huge percentage of total GDP inside of the country. There's a lot of internal tourism in Israel also, and that was not affected. In fact, if anything, that grew during COVID. But still, prices have gone up. You're right, prices have gone up. A lot of that, by the way, is the strengthening of the shekel. And the strengthening of the shekel really made a very, very big difference. There was an article in The Economist a number of months ago that named Israel as in Tel Aviv, as the most expensive city in the world. And what they weren't paying attention to is that was basically all because the shekel got so strong. And it's not that it had become much more expensive for an Israeli living in Tel Aviv, but for a tourist coming to Tel Aviv, having to spend the same amount of dollars, the same amount of shekel as before, but that turns into a whole lot more dollars, basically made it look like it was very, very expensive.
One of our experts says that pre-COVID tourism in Israel represented 10 to 11% of the economy.
Thank you.
So I want you to talk a little about your center, the Taub Center. Are you the founder? I mean, have you been there forever? Is my first question. And second is, so you do all this analysis, you show us these graphs. What do you do with it, and who listens to you? Does anybody listen? I mean, what do you do?
That's super. So let's go from the beginning. No, the Taub Center has been around for 40 years now. I've been at the center for 7. I'm a full-time professor at Bar-Ilan University. So but I am also a full-time president at the Taub Center, and that's always a lot of fun putting the two together. But in any case, it has been around for a long time. The original vision for the Taub Center was of Menachem Begin, and he was looking at Brookings in Washington, and he thought that Israel could really use a high-level think tank, a high-level research center that would not be government dependent in any way, but would be able to do socioeconomic research that would be able to inform government about where the problems were and what needed to be done in order to alleviate them. To that end, he actually turned to the American JDC, American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, who has a long history of raising up projects until it can stand on its own 2 feet, and then allowing it to, and then pulling out when that can happen. So the JDC were actually the ones, or some people from within it, were actually the ones who actually started the center. And the center will not take any kind of government funding. It all comes from private foundations, from private people who help us fund the center. And the research we do is always determined from within the center, never determined from outside the center. We always listen to everybody, but we decide what we think are the most important issues in order for us to research. Now, with respect to dissemination is a huge part of what we do. Every paper that we write, we make sure that it has, first of all, policy implications that are important for the country, and then we target it. We make sure that we know who the parties are who most need to see it, whether it's ministers in the government, whether it's Knesset members, whether it's workers within the ministries. It doesn't matter who it is. We make sure that they get it into their hands. And we will write letters and target those people and send them the research and offer them meetings if they would like meetings. We, of course, also get it to the press. and we also get it to the public. But we really make sure that the information gets out there and that the story gets out there, and that's the way that we're able to have an impact.
Do you study Palestinian society as well? Do you get data from that and compare that to like Arab-Israeli society?
No, we really only look at Arab-Israeli society or Israeli society in general, including Arab-Israeli society, and we don't look at Palestinian society.
You mentioned the Bedouins. How much do you study them? Because we're going to spend time when we go to Israel, leaving next week. Our first 3 days are going to be down in the Negev. We're going to be in Sde Boker. We're going to spend time, exploring that part of Israel, which is a different part than most tourists go to, I would say. They do pass through. They don't really stop. But Bedouins is something that particularly has been of interest to CSP. We've done some programs about the Bedouin community. Is that community doing any better, the same, worse? And do you spend a lot of time trying to understand what's going on there?
They are doing better, but they are still the weakest society inside of Israeli, the weakest group inside of Israeli society. I seem to have I lost you?
Nope, I'm here. Can you hear us?
On my screen. Okay.
Oh.
All right. Okay, there we are. The Bedouin society is the weakest socioeconomically. They're the ones who need the most assistance, who are in the worst shape of any of the societies. We do study them. First of all, with all our studies, we tend to look at all the different populations inside of Israel, and there's certainly one who never escape, your sight. In addition, we did a very, very large paper recently on the south of Israel, on the Negev, which is what I know you're going to be looking at when you're here. And I hope we have put that up in the chat box, link to it, and anybody should be able to download it. Ari, if you don't have it, we can send it to you certainly.
I think Dina sent it to me, so I'll share it with people after the program. Dina, if you don't mind, well, I can try to chat to everybody as well if I have a moment. But if not, I will share that with people in a follow-up. So let's go with the Haredi world for a second. When you talk about Israel's population, Israel growing, I assume the population that's really growing is the Haredi world and the Arab Israeli world, because that's what seems to be one that's growing. So who is the major, what is the major cause of the Israeli population growth? Is it, as I suspect, the Haredi world and maybe the Arab Israelis? And if so, what does that bode for the future of Israel if those two parts of Israeli society are growing the most, and they seem to have the most challenges economically based on what you've shown us?
And so let me back that up a little bit. The Haredi population is certainly the part that is growing the most. The Arab population is not. The growth rate within the Arab population is very, very similar, slightly below that of the Jewish population inside of Israel. So therefore, the current 21% of the population being Arab Israeli, that's not going to grow very much at all. And in fact, it is expected to fall because fertility rates inside of the Arab population have been going down for a very, very long time. And they continue to go down. Just to give you an example, if you go back to 1970, now it's 50 years, but the number of children per Muslim woman was 9, and today it's under 3.
Is that because of the higher education now of the women?
Higher education and higher income. That's what causes that. And the only population where that hasn't happened is in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population, where numbers have also gone down, but not nearly as sharply as they have in other populations. Basically, because having children is considered a mitzvah among the Haredi see them as a mitzvah. Therefore, they want as many children as possible. So that has not gone down very significantly. But the main driver for the increase in fertility in the number of people in Israel is not the Haredi population. It was actually an increase among secular Jews. That because they are the majority of people inside of Israel, therefore their effect was actually larger than that of the Haredi population. But you're right that if I take a look over a longer period, you expect a continued growth in the Haredi population and the Arab population not necessarily, but you do see that those percentages are going to grow. Now, what does that mean? How does that bode for Israeli society? Well, on the one hand, you're going to obviously have a growing society. The number of people in Israel is growing very, very quickly. The problem being that the Haredi men don't get a very good education, and they also in high school, and they also the very large percentage don't tend to be in the labor force. So therefore, that is a very, very big difficulty that the country faces. It's changing. It's changing slowly. It's changing a little bit. But there, for instance, there is a series of schools in Israel that are state schools, but they're state Haredi schools. And if you go back 5 years, they were basically non-existent. And now they're somewhere close to about 4% of Haredi children. That's a very small percentage, but it's a huge growth rate. And we don't know how fast that's going to continue, how much it's going to continue, but there does seem to be more interest in more Haredi circles of getting a better education and getting it later on. We don't know yet how that's going to play out. It's too early to tell, but it is something of real concern.
Thank you. Let's go back to politics for a second, but I'm not asking who you're voting for, don't worry. But I do want to understand, given the instability in Israel with who's in charge, how does that affect Israel's ability to make decisions that affect all the issues that you were bringing up? Because someone has to make decisions. That you talked about the Bank of Israel versus the Ministry of Israel. You're looking at challenges that Israelis are facing. You're making recommendations, but you don't even know who you're talking to because the government changed 5 times in the last X number of years. So is Israel doing a good job, bad job in addressing economic needs for its people because of the political situation?
Well, that's a really, really great question. Definitely during all of the, I'm leaving the last year aside for a second. Until the last year in which you did have a stable government for about a year, it was really incredibly problematic because you really can't pass anything. There was no budget. You can't really make any kinds of real changes that you need to make when there is no budget. You're basically basing your budget on what was there previous years. There are many changes you just are not allowed to make. And therefore that caused real difficulties with Israeli economy. And the last year, on the other hand, a lot of steps were taken that were steps that Israel desperately needed. First of all, passing a budget, but second of all, doing things like trying to open up to more imports, trying to lower the amount of bureaucracy to some extent, many different types of steps that were taken that were important and that need to continue being taken. So if a government is formed, it will be able to act. If, again, you're going to have a situation with a stalemate and no stable government is able to be formed, that you have another set of elections, half a year down the line, then that's a real concern.
You mentioned exports. I want to ask about the Emirates and how that is impacting, how that is or will impact the Israeli economy, the breakthrough with the Abraham Accords.
It certainly has the potential to impact. The impact has not been that great yet, but it certainly has the potential to be more than it is currently. And of course, just the fact that you're signing these peace accords with these countries is something that's very, very important moving forward.
So as tourists coming, we only come for 10 days, and we're probably more interested in the falafel than what's going on in Israeli society. But I think a CSP group, and it is the best falafel, which is good. But we got to look up after we eat and look around. What should we be looking for? Like, what do you want us to look at to understand Israel better based on your research into Israeli society? What should we be looking for when we're just walking around? Is it something that will resonate with us, so it gives us a better understanding of what's going on, what life is like in Israel for you and everybody else, other than the touristy stuff that we're going to see?
No, well, I mean, obviously the thing that people you should be looking at are the different people, the different populations. A large part of what makes Israel is it's four very, very different population groups. The secular, the modern religious, the Haredi, the Arab populations, and the different parts of the Arab population. They're all very different from each other, and there's always a lot to learn from each and every one of them. Trying to understand the country without understanding the people, it's very hard to understand the country. So that's the thing that I would tell you to look at as tourists. You're going to be in all kinds, especially if you're in the South. You're going to be seeing lots of different types of populations there. It'll be interesting to learn from them.
Great. So before we end, Howard Meritz, one of our patrons, has a quick question. So Howard, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. Very interesting information. What's been happening to the immigration rate versus the emigration, ex-migration rate, is it still net positive?
Oh,
And
yes.
and do you think that it will shrink or grow? And if it shrinks and the majority of the growth becomes dependent upon internal, organic growth, what will that do to some of the things you've discussed?
Oh, immigration has actually been significantly higher than emigration, and that has continued. And in fact, now in the past couple of years, been even higher than it had been previously. A lot of what's going on right now deals with the Ukraine-Russia war, and we have many immigrants who are coming from Russia, and we have many who are coming from the Ukraine. And that's that's the bulk of it right now. In earlier years, you had a lot of French Jews coming to Israel because of all kinds of anti-Semitism inside of France. So you have actually had quite a lot of immigration, and immigration has not been great. You do talk about the brain drain, but it has not really been that significant. And I don't see that really changing in the very near future.
Great question. Thank you, Howard. Last question for me is, and given our time, we're almost done. In the United States, COVID led to a lot of people leaving main cities like New York, moving out to be safer. Now I think people are moving back. We have, rental rates went down. Now they're through the roof. In Israel, are you seeing people moving to different parts of the country because of economic reasons? Is there, we're going to the Negev. Is there a big growth down there, for example? Or are people kind of staying where they grew up? What change is happening in that regard?
You are seeing a little bit of it. You're seeing the start of it, but its potential is very, very large. And in fact, its potential with respect to housing prices is very significant. The ability of people to work from far, to work remotely, makes a big difference with respect to how close you need to live to where you're working. And the result of that is potentially that you could have a lot of people saying, well, I don't need to live in the middle of Tel Aviv in order to get to work, or even in a city near Tel Aviv. If I get decent transportation going, I can live further away, come into my office twice a week and work from home 3 times a week or something along those lines. And therefore I can allow myself to live further away, live in more spacious housing, live someplace with not as much pollution. And that could change the entire demand and supply of housing inside of the center of the country. And that's something we're looking forward. With respect to the south that you were talking about, there has been actually an increase in the population living there significantly. And there have been some interesting changes with respect to who's going there, because you have more highly educated people going there than they were in the past.
Last question is internet access. I think you mentioned that Israel wasn't as advanced as I thought it was. There are other parts of the world that have very fast internet. The United States is not the greatest. I don't know if there's a chart that's showing it, but I understand that certain parts of Asia have incredibly fast internet and internet access. Where is Israel when it comes to internet access for all and speed and all that? Because that does affect economic growth, given the high-tech world we all live in and the high-tech world that Israel is disproportionately playing in.
It's not nearly as good as you would have thought it would be in what we all like to call the startup nation. And in particular, the place where it lacks are in the north and in the south, and particularly near the villages, near the Arab villages, or into the Arab villages. The level of internet or fast internet is relatively poor. And that, of course, affected during COVID. It affected the ability to give schooling remotely. It affected the ability to work remotely. It affects the types of fields that people choose to go into, because if you have to move to Tel Aviv in order to work in high tech, why bother studying high tech if you don't want to move to Tel Aviv? And therefore, it can have very, very large effects. In other words, that's one of the most important things to invest in, is to allow people to develop by giving them options that are going to give them higher income in the future.
And I think studies have shown that access to internet also affects, democracy. It affects decisions people make. Access to more information other than, real information may play a bigger role in other parts of Israeli society. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time. Thank you for giving us such a deep dive into aspects of Israel. I know I appreciate it for for me personally, because I'm going there in just a few days, and it makes my trip even more exciting. You've given me things to look forward to understanding and seeing. And on behalf of CSP, thank you for making Israel more understandable to us. We really get a very thin understanding of Israel from the media. It only focuses on one issue, and usually a distorted part in a distorted way. So this was a much more interesting presentation. We look forward to having you back. I asked you if this changes every year. You said this changes every lecture. So it means we can have you back for more presentations and maybe more focused on different segments. And everybody's coming to Israel. Look forward to seeing you on the airplane. But we have lots of CSP this week, so look forward to seeing you all at CSP. Thank you, Dina Friedman, for making this possible, taking all the arrangements behind the scenes. And take care.
Larry.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody. I will send you lots of follow-up from the Taub Center so you can read the papers. Paul Lips, thank you for joining us from Israel. And that's all I got. I got to go spend time with my kids.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye. Take care, everybody. Nice seeing you all.